The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Highway 87 as Jake Martinez wiped the sweat from his forehead. His own pickup truck hummed steadily as he drove toward the auto parts store in town. It was supposed to be a quick trip to grab some spark plugs for Mrs. Henderson's car, but the Texas heat was already making the day feel longer than it should. Jake had been running Martinez Auto Repair for nearly 15 years. His small garage sat on the edge of Millerville, a town where everyone knew everyone, and helping your neighbor was just what you did. At 38, Jake had calloused hands that told stories of countless engines fixed and problems solved. His reputation for honest work had spread throughout the county. As he rounded the bend near Miller's Creek, something caught his eye. An old blue truck sat on the shoulder of the road. Its hood propped open like a mouth gasping for air. Steam rose from the engine bay, creating small clouds in the desert air. Jake could see a figure standing beside the truck, hands on hips in the universal pose of automotive frustration. Without hesitation, Jake pulled over. His father had taught him long ago that you never pass someone stranded on the road. "Could be your wife or daughter next time," his father always said. Jake grabbed his toolbox from the back of his truck and walked toward the stranger. The man standing by the broken truck was probably in his 60s, with silver hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He wore simple clothes, jeans, and a faded work shirt, but something about his posture suggested he was used to being in charge. When he saw Jake approaching, relief washed over his face. "Engine trouble?" Jake called out as he got closer. "Afraid so," the man replied. His voice was deep and steady. "She just started overheating about 5 minutes ago. Steam everywhere, temperature gauge buried in the red." Jake set his toolbox down and peered into the engine bay. The truck was old, probably from the late 80s, but it was well maintained. Someone had taken care of this vehicle. The engine was clean, the parts organized. This was not a truck that had been neglected. "Mind if I take a look?" Jake asked. "Please," the man said. "I was hoping to make it to San Antonio today, but it looks like those plans might be changing." Jake leaned over the engine, his experienced eyes quickly scanning for obvious problems. The radiator was definitely the source of the steam. He touched the upper radiator hose carefully and immediately pulled his hand back. The hose was burning hot, which meant coolant was not circulating properly. "When's the last time you changed your thermostat?" Jake asked. The man thought for a moment. "Probably 3 years ago, maybe 4. "That's likely your problem," Jake said. "Thermostat's stuck closed. Coolant can't circulate, engine overheats. Pretty common on trucks this age." Jake walked back to his truck and returned with a jug of water and some basic tools. "We need to let her cool down first," he explained. "Trying to work on a hot engine is a good way to get burned or make things worse." The two men stood in the shade of Jake's truck, waiting for the engine temperature to drop. The stranger introduced himself simply as Robert. He asked about Jake's business, seeming genuinely interested in the challenges of running a small auto repair shop in a small town. "It's honest work," Jake explained. "People around here depend on their vehicles. Farmer's truck breaks down during harvest. That's his whole income at risk. Lady's car won't start and she can't get to work at the hospital. It's not just about fixing engines. It's about keeping people's lives moving." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "You enjoy it?" "Most days," Jake said with a grin. "Some days I wonder what it would be like to have a job where everything was predictable. Same routine, same problems, same solutions. But then someone like Mrs. Patterson brings in her grandson's motorcycle, and it turns out the kid tried to modify it himself and created this amazing puzzle to solve. Those are the days that make it worth it." After 20 minutes, Jake tested the radiator cap. The pressure had dropped enough to work safely. He carefully removed the thermostat housing, a job that would normally require draining the entire cooling system. But Jake had learned some tricks over the years. "There's your problem," he said, holding up the old thermostat. The metal spring inside was clearly stuck in the closed position. "This little guy gave up the ghost." "Can you fix it?" Robert asked. Jake looked at his watch. It was still early and the parts store would be open. I can run into town and grab a new thermostat. Should have you back on the road in an hour or so. I couldn't ask you to do that, Robert said. You were clearly headed somewhere yourself. Just picking up parts for another job, Jake replied. Nothing that can't wait. Besides, leaving someone stranded on this highway in this heat wouldn't sit right with me. The drive to town took 15 minutes each way. Jake found the right thermostat at Murphy's Auto Parts and grabbed a gallon of coolant while he was there. Tom Murphy, who owned the store, asked about the stranded motorist. Don't recognize the description, Tom said. But that truck sounds familiar. Blue Chevy from the late 80s? Someone's been buying parts for that truck for years. Always pays cash, always knows exactly what he needs. Jake found that interesting, but did not think much of it. Regular maintenance was the sign of a responsible owner. He paid for the parts and headed back to the highway. Robert had been busy while Jake was gone. He had cleaned up the work area, organized Jake's tools, and even swept debris away from around the truck. When Jake returned, everything was ready for the repair. You didn't have to do all that, Jake said. Habit, Robert replied. My father taught me to leave every workspace better than I found it. Jake installed the new thermostat with practiced efficiency. The job required removing several hoses and the housing cover, then carefully sealing everything back together. Robert watched with obvious interest, asking intelligent questions about the process. You seem to know your way around engines, Jake observed. I've picked up a few things over the years, Robert said. Had to maintain my own vehicles in some pretty remote places. Sometimes you can't wait for help to arrive. Jake filled the cooling system with fresh coolant and started the engine. The temperature gauge climbed to normal operating range and stayed there. No steam, no overheating, no problems. That should do it, Jake said, wiping his hands on a rag. Give it a few minutes to make sure everything's working properly, then you should be good to go. They let the truck idle while they cleaned up the tools and disposed of the old parts. The engine purred smoothly, the cooling fan cycling on and off as designed. Robert watched the temperature gauge like a hawk, but it remained steady in the normal range. How much do I owe you? Robert asked. Jake thought about it. The thermostat had cost $12. The coolant was $8. His time and expertise were worth something, but this was not exactly a formal repair job. $25 should cover it, Jake said. Robert reached into his wallet and pulled out two $20 bills. Keep the change, he said, and thank you. This means more to me than you might realize. Just glad I could help, Jake replied. As Robert prepared to leave, he paused and looked directly at Jake. You know, I meet a lot of people in my line of work. People who say the right things, do what's expected, follow the rules. But finding someone who just helps because it's the right thing to do, that's rarer than you might think. Not around here, Jake said. This is just how people are in Millerville. Robert smiled. Maybe so, but not everywhere is Millerville. They shook hands and Robert climbed into his truck. The engine started immediately, running smooth and quiet. He waved as he pulled back onto the highway, heading south toward San Antonio. Jake watched until the blue truck disappeared around the next curve, then gathered his tools and headed back to his own vehicle. He had work to do, and the day was getting hotter. Mrs. Henderson would be wondering about her spark plugs. As he drove toward town, Jake felt good about the morning. Helping someone in need always left him with a sense of satisfaction. His grandfather used to say that kindness was like a stone thrown into a pond. You never knew how far the ripples would spread. Jake had no way of knowing that his simple act of roadside assistance had just set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. In his wallet, Robert carried identification that would have shocked the small-town mechanic. But for now, Jake was just happy to have helped a fellow traveler get back on the road. The sun climbed higher as Jake reached the outskirts of Millerville. Another day, another chance to solve problems and help people. It was the kind of life that made sense to him. Simple, honest, predictable. By tomorrow, predictable would no longer be a word that applied to Jake Martinez's life. 3 days passed before Jake thought about the man with the blue truck again. Life had returned to its normal rhythm. Mrs. Henderson's car was running perfectly with its new spark plugs. The Gonzalez family's minivan needed a brake job. Tommy Wilson's motorcycle required a complete tune-up before the weekend rally. Jake's hands stayed busy, and his mind focused on the familiar challenges of pistons, gaskets, and electrical systems. It was Thursday afternoon when Carol Simpson walked into his garage. Carol worked at the Millerville post office and had been sorting mail for 23 years. She knew everyone's business, not because she was nosy, but because keeping track of who got what mail was part of her job. "Jake, you got something unusual coming your way," she said, holding an official-looking envelope. "Express mail, government seal. Figured I'd bring it over personally instead of waiting for tomorrow's delivery." Jake wiped his hands and took the envelope. His name and address were typed on expensive letterhead. The return address made his stomach drop. Department of Defense, Pentagon, Washington, D.C. "What do you think that could be about?" Carol asked, her curiosity obvious. "No idea," Jake said honestly. He had never been in the military, had no government contracts, and could not think of any reason the Pentagon would contact him. After Carol left, Jake stared at the envelope for several minutes. Finally, he opened it carefully. Inside was a formal letter on official letterhead, along with a business card and what appeared to be travel documents. The letter was brief, but mind-boggling. "Mr. Martinez, your assistance is requested for a consultation regarding automotive maintenance protocols. Please contact the undersigned at your earliest convenience to arrange travel to Washington, D.C. All expenses will be covered. Your expertise is needed for a matter of national importance." The letter was signed by Colonel Patricia Wells and included a direct phone number with a Washington area code. Jake read it 3 times, certain he was missing something. Automotive maintenance protocols? National importance? This had to be some kind of mistake. Jake called the number. A professional voice answered on the second ring. "Colonel Wells's office. Sergeant Davis speaking. This is Jake Martinez. I received a letter asking me to call this number. Please hold for Colonel Wells, Mr. Martinez." Moments later, a woman's voice came on the line. "Mr. Martinez, thank you for calling. I know this must seem unusual, but we have a situation where your specific skills and experience could be extremely valuable." "I think there's been a mistake," Jake said. "I run a small auto repair shop in Texas. I don't know anything about national security or military stuff. Mr. Martinez, 3 days ago you assisted a stranded motorist on Highway 87. You replaced a faulty thermostat and refused payment beyond the cost of parts. Is that correct?" Jake's blood went cold. How could the Pentagon possibly know about that? "Yes, but how did you—" "The individual you assisted filed a report recommending you for a consultation position. He was quite impressed with your diagnostic skills, work ethic, and character. We need someone with exactly those qualities." "Who was he?" Jake asked. "I'm not at liberty to discuss that over an unsecured line, but I can tell you that his recommendation carries significant weight. Would you be willing to travel to Washington for a briefing? It would only take a day or two, and as I mentioned, all expenses are covered." Jake's mind was racing. This was completely outside his experience. "Can you tell me anything about what this consultation involves?" "Vehicle maintenance issues related to specialized equipment." "Nothing classified in the consultation itself, but the context is sensitive. You would be helping us solve some practical problems that our regular maintenance personnel haven't been able to handle." Jake looked around his garage. 3 vehicles waited for his attention. Mrs. Patterson's grandson's motorcycle sat in the corner, still presenting its mechanical puzzle. This was his life, his world. The idea of flying to Washington, D.C. to consult for the Pentagon seemed like something from a movie. "I need to think about this," Jake said. Of course, but we would appreciate an answer within 24 hours. Time is a factor in this situation. After hanging up, Jake sat in his office chair, staring at the letter. He called his wife Maria at the elementary school where she taught 3rd grade. "Pentagon?" Maria said when he explained. "Jake, are you sure this isn't some kind of scam?" I called the number. It seemed legitimate. Government office, military personnel. But I can't figure out what they could possibly want with me. "What did you do 3 days ago that someone would report to the Pentagon?" Jake told her about helping Robert with the broken thermostat. As he described the encounter, details came back to him. The way Robert had organized the tools. His comment about maintaining vehicles in remote places. The quality of his questions about the repair process. "Maybe he wasn't just some guy with car trouble," Maria said. That evening, Jake called his brother David, who had served in the Army for 12 years before becoming a high school coach. David listened to the story and asked to see the letter. "This is real," David said after examining the official documents. "Government letterhead, proper protocols, authentic contact information. Someone with serious authority wants to talk to you." "But why me? There are thousands of mechanics with more experience, more training, more qualifications." "Maybe it's not just about mechanical skills," David suggested. "Military people pay attention to character, integrity, how someone acts when they think nobody's watching. You helped a stranger on the highway because it was the right thing to do. Maybe that's what impressed him." Jake spent a restless night thinking about the decision. Part of him was curious about what problem could possibly require his expertise. Another part was terrified of stepping into a world he knew nothing about. But the biggest part was practical. His garage needed him. His customers depended on him. How could he justify flying across the country for something that might be completely outside his abilities? The next morning brought an answer in an unexpected form. Robert walked into his garage. Jake was under the hood of the Gonzalez minivan when he heard footsteps. He slid out from under the vehicle to see the man he had helped on the highway standing in his shop, wearing the same simple clothes but somehow looking different, more official, more serious. "Hello, Jake," Robert said. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Jake replied, wiping his hands. "Truck running okay?" "Perfect. Your repair was exactly what it needed." Robert paused, looking around the garage with obvious appreciation. "You received some communication from Washington." It was not a question. Jake nodded. "I wanted to speak with you personally before you made your decision," Robert continued. "What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room. Do I have your word?" Jake nodded again, though his heart was pounding. "My name is General Robert Harrison. I'm what the military calls a 4-star general. I oversee transportation and logistics for several specialized units. 3 days ago, I was driving to an important meeting in San Antonio when my personal vehicle broke down." Jake felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. A 4-star general. He had been talking casually with one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States military. "You could have called someone," Jake managed to say. "Military personnel. Official vehicles." "I was traveling unofficially," General Harrison explained. "Sometimes it's important for people in my position to move around without the usual protocols. No motorcades, no security details, no advance teams, just a man in an old truck trying to get from point A to point B." "But why come to me now? Why not just say thank you and move on?" General Harrison walked over to Jake's workbench, examining the organized tools and clean workspace. "Because of how you approached the problem. You diagnosed the issue quickly and correctly. You refused to overcharge for the solution. You treated me with respect without knowing who I was. And most importantly, you did it all because it was the right thing to do." Jake was beginning to understand. "The consultation request." "We have a situation," General Harrison said. "Several specialized vehicles in remote locations are experiencing maintenance issues that our regular personnel cannot diagnose. These vehicles are critical to ongoing operations. The manufacturer's technical support is inadequate. We need someone who can think independently, work efficiently, and solve problems without needing a manual. But there must be military mechanics with more experience than me. Military mechanics are trained to follow procedures. They're excellent at maintaining standard equipment according to established protocols. But when something unusual happens, when the manual doesn't have the answer, they often struggle. You fixed my truck in an hour with basic tools and creative thinking. That's exactly what we need. Jake looked around his garage again. Everything here made sense to him. The problems were straightforward, the solutions were logical, and the consequences were manageable. What General Harrison was describing sounded much more complicated. What kind of vehicles are we talking about? Specialized transport equipment. Some of it is modified civilian vehicles. Some is custom-built for specific missions. The exact details would be part of the briefing in Washington. And if I can't solve the problems? Then you return home with our gratitude and a consulting fee that should cover any lost business during your absence. But I believe you can help us, Jake. Sometimes fresh eyes and practical experience are more valuable than advanced degrees and military training. Jake thought about his conversation with Maria, about David's advice, about the letter from Colonel Wells. This was an opportunity that would probably never come again, a chance to contribute to something bigger than brake jobs and tune-ups. How long would this take? Initial consultation is 3 days. If we need additional assistance, we would negotiate a longer arrangement. But there's no obligation beyond the initial visit. Jake made his decision. Okay, I'll do it. General Harrison smiled for the first time since entering the garage. Outstanding. Colonel Wells will contact you with travel arrangements. And Jake, thank you. What you did on the highway and what you're agreeing to do now, it matters more than you might realize. After the general left, Jake called Maria to tell her about his decision. Then he called Colonel Wells to confirm his availability. By the end of the day, he had plane tickets to Washington, D.C., and instructions for reporting to the Pentagon on Monday morning. As he closed the garage that evening, Jake realized his life had just taken a turn he never could have predicted. 3 days ago, he had been a small-town mechanic helping a stranded motorist. Now he was preparing to consult for the United States military on matters of national importance. The strangest part was that it all started with a $20 thermostat and his father's advice about never passing someone stranded on the road. Sometimes the smallest actions had the biggest consequences. Monday morning found Jake Martinez standing outside the Pentagon at 6:30, wearing his best pair of jeans and a clean button-down shirt. He had flown into Washington, D.C. the previous evening, stayed at a hotel that was nicer than any place he had ever been, and spent a restless night wondering what he had gotten himself into. The Pentagon was bigger than anything Jake had imagined. The building seemed to stretch forever in every direction, and the security procedures were unlike anything he had experienced. After checking in with multiple guards and receiving a temporary badge, he was escorted through hallways that could have held his entire garage. Colonel Wells met him at a security checkpoint on the 3rd floor. She was a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of military service. "Mr. Martinez, welcome to Washington. I trust your travel was comfortable?" "Yes, ma'am. Though I have to admit this is all pretty overwhelming." "Perfectly understandable. Let's start with a briefing. Then we'll show you what we're dealing with." Colonel Wells led him to a conference room where several other people waited. They introduced themselves as logistics specialists, transportation engineers, and field maintenance supervisors. Jake shook hands with each of them, feeling increasingly out of place among all the military ranks and technical degrees. "Gentlemen, this is Jake Martinez," Colonel Wells announced. "He's the consultant General Harrison recommended for our current situation." Jake could see skepticism in some of the faces around the table. He was just a guy from Texas who fixed cars and trucks. These people had advanced training, military experience, and access to sophisticated equipment. What could he possibly offer them? Colonel Wells activated a large screen and began showing photographs. We have 3 vehicles experiencing similar problems in different locations. All are modified civilian trucks used for specialized transport missions. All have suffered the same type of failure, and none of our standard diagnostic procedures have identified the cause. The photographs showed trucks that looked normal on the outside, but clearly had been heavily modified. Jake could see additional electrical systems, reinforced chassis components, and cooling systems that were much larger than standard. Each vehicle carries sensitive equipment that requires precise temperature control, Colonel Wells continued. The cooling systems have been failing unpredictably, putting the missions at risk. Our maintenance teams have replaced every component twice, followed every diagnostic protocol, and consulted with the manufacturers. Nothing works. Major Rodriguez, one of the transportation engineers, spoke up. We've spent 3 months and significant resources on this problem. The manufacturer's technical support team has been out twice with no results. We're running out of options. Jake studied the photographs more carefully. The trucks were similar to vehicles he worked on regularly, but the modifications were extensive. Can you show me the cooling system specifications? Colonel Wells handed him a thick technical manual. Jake flipped through pages of diagrams, part numbers, and technical specifications. The information was detailed, but somehow missed something important. These manuals show what was installed, but they don't show how everything works together, Jake observed. When you modify a system this extensively, the relationships between components change. A part that works perfectly in isolation might cause problems when it's part of a larger system. Captain Morrison, a logistics specialist, leaned forward. Can you explain what you mean? Jake thought about how to put his understanding into words that would make sense to people trained in military procedures. It's like cooking, he said finally. You can have the best ingredients in the world, but if you combine them in the wrong proportions or the wrong order, the final dish doesn't work. These trucks were built by adding components to meet specific requirements, but I don't think anyone looked at how all those components would affect each other. The room was quiet for a moment. Then General Harrison walked in. Sorry I'm late, he said. How's our consultation going? Mr. Martinez was just explaining his theory about system integration, Colonel Wells replied. General Harrison looked at Jake. What's your assessment so far? I think the cooling problems are being caused by something that's not in the cooling system, Jake said. All these modifications create heat and electrical demand that the original design never had to handle. The cooling system is failing because it's trying to compensate for problems somewhere else. Major Rodriguez frowned. Our diagnostic procedures would have identified any electrical issues. Your diagnostic procedures are designed for standard vehicles, Jake replied carefully. But these trucks aren't standard anymore. They're custom machines that need to be understood as complete systems, not collections of individual parts. General Harrison nodded. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. Are you ready to look at the actual vehicles? They took Jake to a secure motor pool where one of the problematic trucks was parked. Under the hood, Jake could see immediately what the technical manuals had missed. The modifications had been installed expertly, but they created a web of interconnected systems that put demands on the original vehicle design in ways that were never intended. Has anyone mapped the electrical load on the alternator? Jake asked. The maintenance team leader, Sergeant First Class Thompson, checked his documentation. Electrical systems are within manufacturer specifications. But what about total electrical load including all the modifications? Sergeant Thompson looked uncertain. We tested each system individually. Jake spent the next 2 hours tracing electrical connections, measuring actual power consumption, and documenting how the various systems interacted. What he found confirmed his suspicions. The modifications were drawing more power than the alternator could consistently provide, especially under certain operating conditions. When electrical demand exceeds generating capacity, the alternator works harder and generates more heat, Jake explained. That extra heat has to go somewhere, and it's going into the cooling system. Your cooling system isn't faulty. It's just being asked to do more than it was designed for. Major Rodriguez looked skeptical. But our electrical measurements showed everything within normal ranges. Individual measurements, yes. But you measured each system when it was the only load on the alternator. In actual operation, when multiple modified systems are running simultaneously, total demand exceeds capacity. The vehicle's computer tries to compensate by adjusting various systems, which creates irregular heat loads that the cooling system can't handle predictably. Jake suggested a solution that was simpler than anyone expected. Instead of replacing cooling system components or redesigning electrical systems, they needed to install a secondary alternator to handle the additional electrical demand from the modifications. The cooling system could then operate as originally designed, without having to compensate for electrical system heat. That's a much less expensive solution than what we've been trying, Captain Morrison observed. Sometimes the simplest answer is the right answer, Jake replied. But you have to understand the whole system to see it. Over the next 2 days, Jake worked with the maintenance teams to implement his solution on all 3 vehicles. The results were immediate and dramatic. The cooling problems disappeared, the vehicles operated more efficiently, and several other minor issues that had been attributed to normal wear also resolved themselves. General Harrison asked Jake to join him for lunch on his final day. "Your solution worked perfectly," the general said as they sat in the Pentagon cafeteria. "More importantly, you taught our people to think differently about complex problems." "I just approached it the way I approach any problem in my garage," Jake replied. "Start with what you can see, understand how everything connects, and don't assume the obvious answer is always right. That's exactly why I recommended you. Our people are trained to follow procedures and trust technology, but sometimes you need someone who trusts their own judgment and isn't afraid to question assumptions." General Harrison paused, then continued. "I have a proposition for you, Jake. We'd like to offer you a permanent consulting position. You would work on complex vehicle problems that our regular procedures can't solve. The pay would be significantly more than you make at your garage, and you'd be contributing to important national security missions." Jake thought about the offer. The work had been interesting, and he had clearly made a valuable contribution. The money would make a huge difference for his family. But he also thought about Millerville, about Mrs. Henderson and the Gonzalez family, and all the other people who depended on him. "It's a generous offer," Jake said, "but I have a life in Millerville, people who count on me. I can't just abandon them." "What if we could structure something that worked for everyone?" General Harrison asked. "A few days per month, travel to specific problems that need your expertise, but still allowing you to maintain your business at home?" That changed everything. Jake could contribute to something important without abandoning the community that had supported him for 15 years. The arrangement they worked out was better than Jake could have imagined. He would consult on specialized problems 6 days per month, with all travel expenses covered, and a consulting fee that was more than he made in a typical month at the garage. The military would provide advanced diagnostic equipment for his shop, and he would train other mechanics in the kind of systems thinking approach that had solved their cooling problem. More importantly, Jake discovered that his practical, common-sense approach to problem-solving was exactly what was needed for the increasingly complex challenges of maintaining specialized military equipment. His reputation grew within the Defense Department, and he found himself consulting on everything from helicopter maintenance to submarine electrical systems. 6 months later, Martinez Auto Repair had expanded into a larger building with 3 additional mechanics. Jake still handled the complex problems and customer relations, but he also spent several days each month traveling to military installations across the country, solving problems that had stumped teams of engineers. The transformation started with a simple act of kindness on a Texas highway. Jake had stopped to help a stranger with car trouble because it was the right thing to do. He had no way of knowing that the stranger was a 4-star general, or that his approach to the repair would demonstrate exactly the kind of practical problem-solving skills the military desperately needed. Maria often joked that her husband had become an accidental expert in military logistics. Jake preferred to think that he had simply found a way to use his skills to help a wider range of people solve their problems. The blue truck still drove past his garage occasionally. General Harrison had retired from active duty, but kept the old truck as a reminder of an important lesson. Sometimes the most valuable expertise comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the biggest problems have the simplest solutions. Jake kept a photo in his office of the Pentagon motor pool where he had diagnosed his first military vehicle problem. Beneath it, he had written his father's old saying, "Kindness is like a stone thrown into a pond. You never know how far the ripples will spread." In Jake's case, those ripples had spread all the way from a highway outside Millerville to the highest levels of the United States military, creating opportunities and connections that changed his life in ways he never could have imagined. And it all started because he knew better than to drive past someone who needed help.